All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight for EcoSlow's first virtual Green Drinks event. My name is Anna Tolkien, and I am the Sustainability Assistant with EcoSlow. For those of you who may not know that much about EcoSlow, we are the Environmental Center of San Luis Obispo County and a 501c3 nonprofit that educates, advocates, and acts to protect our beautiful Central Coast. We run many different programs, including beach cleanups, tree plantings, docent-led hikes, green drinks events, and as of January this year, we now also house the SLO County Green Business Program, which I help run. We recognize what a difficult time this is for many people, so we really hope you are all staying healthy and well. April is usually a really big month for EcoSlow since Earth Day is coming up on the 22nd. But unfortunately, all of our in-person events and other volunteer opportunities have been canceled. So we've started a social media campaign for Earth Month to follow EcoSlow on Instagram and Facebook. Tips, plant-based meal recipes, and other local creative ways to continue connecting with you all during this time, which is why we are hopefully going to be having much more or many more Green Drinks events after this. Many of our events and a lot of our work, like tonight's Green Drinks events, funded through donations. So if you would like to donate to EcoSlow, you can visit our website, www.ecoslow.org. We are so appreciative of everyone's support, and your support allows us to keep putting on fun events like this. So we really appreciate it. And if you'd like to get involved with EcoSlow or join one of our committees, feel free to sign up for a newsletter on our website, or you can email me as well, anna@ecoslow.org. For tonight's Green Drinks event, we are going to be talking about beavers in the Salinas, and we are super grateful to have two awesome speakers with us. First, we have Devin Best, who's the Executive Director of the Upper Salinas Las Tablas Resource Conservation District, kind of a mouthful. He grew up on the Central Coast and graduated from Humboldt State University in ethnobotany, and has a background in watershed restoration with a focus on species recovery along the West Coast. So this is really right up his alley, and he is currently working with Creeklands Conservation to develop a Salinas River watershed management plan. Our other speaker tonight is Stuart Suplick, who graduated from Cal Poly recently with a degree in environmental management, and he also performed research on beavers of the Salinas River. So he definitely is an expert on this topic as well. And he wanted to, part of his research was to understand beavers' potential for restoration assistance in the Salinas, so he'll be touching on that tonight as well. Stuart is currently becoming TEFL certified, and he's pursuing work in education and/or ecosystem management. So before I hand it over to these awesome guys, if you would like to take a photo of yourself with a drink in hand and your computer screen, feel free to post it to your social media and tag us. We're super stoked to engage with all of you tonight, even if it's just virtually. So thanks again, and Devin and Stuart, hand it over to you guys.
Thanks, Anna. Good evening, everybody. I'm talking to my computer, so hopefully everybody can hear me. If someone can give me a thumbs up, that'd be great. But otherwise, I'll just kind of continue on. First and foremost, I'm Devin Best. I'm the Executive Director for the Upper Salinas Las Tablas Resource Conservation District. Stuart and I have a presentation we're going to go through, so I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen, and we'll just go from there. So, and let's see if I can do all this new technology. A week ago, I barely even knew what Zoom was, and now I'm an aficionado at it. So we're all learning the ways to stay connected with everybody, and this is a great way to start. So hopefully everybody can see this. Again, I'm Devin Best, the Executive Director. I work with the Resource Conservation District, which is a local nonprofit agency that covers basically all of northern San Luis Obispo County. I've been working on the Salinas River for, 2020, so over a decade, I guess about 11 years now. And I appreciate Anna reaching out and asking us to be part of this. And with that, I'm going to actually have my counterpart, Stuart, introduce himself as well. Stuart, you're on mute.
There we go. All right, you hear me now?
Yep.
Cool. Yeah, Anna introduced me pretty well. Yeah, I just conducted a bunch of research, spent about a year pretty much solely focused on beaver in the Salinas River watershed. It was an amazing opportunity provided to me, in no small part by my senior thesis advisor, Dr. Yuwen Zhu, who stepped a bit outside of her, a bit outside of her comfort zone from her specialty to oversee my work and definitely give me some good advice when it was needed. Yeah, and I just have a background as far as project management goes, and just really working with a lot of people. So that's partly what attracted me to this research topic, was just beavers. They are a bit infamous, or can be infamous, with people, and they're a lot like us in a lot of ways. So, yeah.
Great. So tonight's presentation, we're going to talk about our local watershed management and the potential for beaver assisted restoration. What are we going to kind of cover over tonight's presentation? What is the watershed science fundamentals we should understand? How do these inform our current Salinas River watershed management approaches? What do we know about the basin beaver populations, and what role could they play in the Salinas River watershed management efforts? And how can we best engage in these efforts? So this is just kind of a general overview of where we're going to present tonight, and there will be opportunities for questions and answers at the end. We'll do our best to answer those as we can. But because I'm normally used to sitting in a room and being able to see people's faces and asking questions of the audience, I'm going to kind of go through some kind of generic overview of what a watershed is. But first, I'd like to kind of quote Aldo Leopold, who is one of our great conservation ecologists. There are two things that interest me: the relation of people to each other, and the relation of people to land. Why is that important? Well, because we all live in a watershed, and I'm not too sure who is in the audience and what your familiarity with what a watershed is, but here's kind of a sterile explanation of what a watershed is. It's a drainage basin, essentially. It's a collection of land mass and surface water flowing to some sort of single point, whether that be another water body, river, the ocean, etc. That's important because we all live in a watershed, whether we realize it or not. Even sometimes I actually gave a presentation to my sister's a high school teacher down in LA, and I asked the kids what watershed they lived in, and they actually didn't know. I had to inform them that they live in the LA basin. So if you're on land, you're in a watershed, one way or the other. And your neighbors are part of that watershed. So it's always good to know where you are and context to your landscape. Let's talk about what a watershed is. It's composed of several elements. We have the uplands, the riparian, and in-stream, and I'll go through each one of those a little bit more. The uplands is obviously the majority of the landscape. It's probably about 90% of the total landscape in a watershed, but it's critical for wildlife, groundwater resources, habitat for other animals, species diversity, et cetera, et cetera. So this is where most of all of our land management practices are. And this is where also we do a lot of our agriculture, et cetera, urban development, everything else that goes into that. So that's mostly the uplands. Then we get into the riparian, and this is a word that some people are familiar with and some are not. But for those who are not, the riparian is that thin strip of vegetation along streams and rivers. It's actually very critical and vital for the health of a watershed. We have a lot of impacts to it. If you look on these pictures, you can see in the middle picture a non-functioning riparian corridor. There's a lack of vegetation on one side of the stream, and that causes all kinds of erosion and pollutants to enter into the stream and get carried on down further. Whereas on the bottom, you'll see a fairly in-depth or intact riparian corridor. It's a place for nutrient cycling, aquatic organisms, sediment retention, species diversity, and flood prevention. So although these are narrow strips of vegetation, they're vital for overall watershed health. And then we get into in-stream habitat. And my background is watershed restoration, but I've been focused primarily on salmonids, particularly steelhead species up and down the West Coast. And so I spent a lot of time basically sticking my head and counting fish and looking for where they are and trying to figure out what the habitat needs are. So there's a lot of components to this. This is basically just a wetted channel. So wherever the flood flows are and down to the center of the channel, it provides habitat for different species for food and shelter, spawning, rearing, et cetera, et cetera. So we spend a lot of time trying to evaluate what's going on in the watershed and looking at the in-stream habitat, but it's in relation to what's going on with the uplands as well as the riparian habitat. So if you're a fisheries biologist, your face is in the creek, but you're always thinking what's going on in the context of the entire watershed as far as the health of it. So I always like this particular drawing. This is actually relevant to the Central Coast. If you look on the far left, you have the Pacific Ocean. And as you move across, you'll see you get all the way out to the Carrizo Plains. This is kind of a good cross-section of our local ecology here, where you have coastal watersheds that receive a fair amount of precipitation. And as you move further east, you get into drier and drier zones. And it kind of reflective of how we go about managing those. You know, if you have flashier watersheds on the coast versus inland where you may have less flashy, meaning they don't respond so quickly to precipitation events, but they have a greater infiltration of groundwater overall. And so you have to kind of think about those terms when you're looking at making recommendations for land management or species recovery or et cetera. So it's always good to kind of keep in mind of those basic three elements, but then also where it lies within the context of where you live and how those climatic factors affect your watershed. So then you look at a watershed, when you're considering it, there's a lot of different things involved. I like this particular graph because there's sort of the biophysiological processes involved, but there's also a social overlay as well. So when you think about it, they all have equal portions that kind of drive how a watershed is managed, and in particular. And you have a level of, there's a limited amount of flexibility within this, but again, when you look at what are the basic parameters of a watershed and then how we manage those, a lot of the social issues become kind of prevalent. You'll see that later on. And in particular, in this side, you see we have some of the major kind of overarching points, which is water supply, water quality, species diversity, geology, land use development. Essentially, all these things kind of relate into issues. How do you balance all those issues when you have competing interests? That's one of the big challenges with being watershed management and trying to work with developing an economy, a viable economy, sustainable lands, and species recovery. And we're going to try and talk about that in the context of Beaver tonight. So how to bring about change? Well, first and foremost, preservation, conservation, restoration. Three words that we use interchangeably in our daily dialogue, but sometimes people don't quite understand what that relates to as far as in natural resource management. So preserve, that means basically in the context of this, of if you have areas that are undisturbed for the most part, to try and keep those intact, conservation easements, designations such as wild and scenic rivers, et cetera. And then conserve, those are areas that have had some interaction, but probably still, for the most part, intact and pristine. And try and make sure those are not impacted by any future anthropogenic factors, and then restore. And that's kind of where I spend more of my time, it seems like anymore, is finding places that have been disturbed and then trying to work to try and restore those to increase the abundance and diversity of species within a watershed. So then right now we're working on the Salinas River Watershed Management Plan. As mentioned before, this was a project funded by Biodiversity First, and we're looking at the entire watershed. So that's about 170 something miles or so of the Salinas River from Monterey County and San Luis Obispo County, and trying to get a framework for identifying resource issues, as well as engaging stakeholder groups, and then developing recommendations for watershed restoration. There are also other planning efforts that have been going on for several years. Some of those are the Salinas Lagoon Management Plan, the Steelhead In-Stream Flow Prescription, the Nosatone Watershed Management Plan, and then the lower two are two that I'm currently working on, which is the Steelhead Conceptual Model and the Salinas River Watershed Management Plan. And those are just some of the current issues and plans in place. And then I'm going to actually turn it over to my counterpart, Stuart.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you, Devin, for giving us that great introduction, so to speak, if any of us needed it, for watershed science and then management as well. And very relevant to that is Beaver. Obviously, that's why I'm here today. As Devin was actually just mentioning, he said a lot of what he does now, or what it seems to him like he does a lot most frequently now often, is restoration. And so Beaver can actually have a good role to play in that. And so in terms of how they can help, there's something out there called process-based restoration. If you go ahead and click next slide. And increasingly in the north and western US, beaver are being integrated into watershed management plans, ecosystem management plans, all for the purpose of, if I think this next picture, go ahead and click, actually demonstrates quite well. As you can see, we have a river that is, or stream that is kind of curling, a bit messy. Forgive me because I'm not a geomorphologist, so I'm not supposed to, it's okay if I don't, I guess, know the term exactly, but I think it's something like anastomosing is how you would describe this river. And it's probably a bit unlike a lot of rivers that you might imagine. And that's because, yeah, it's just messy. Its whole purpose is supposed to be bringing up diversity, and there's a lot more niches that a lot of different species can fill. And so there's been an increasing push in the last few years to use beaver to create this type of environment. Reason being, if you go ahead and click next, is, well, ROSGEN is, might ring a bell for those of us who are professionals in the environmental restoration field. It's basically a classification system to basically deduce function from structure of the stream, as you can see in the top right corner picture there. And from that, there's been a kind of spin-off called ROSGEN Natural Channel Design. Often involves maybe bringing in heavy equipment, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner there. And so this is great in certain contexts, but often it involves just stability, not a dynamic equilibrium or a dynamic stability that you might get with beaver created environments that you can see on the left there. That left picture is actually, I should give credit right now to the University of Utah State University, Joe Whedon. He's recently released this great guidance book on, low-tech process-based restoration. That's where that comes from. And the whole idea of wanting to go towards that and towards beaver in general is because it's a lot more cost-effective if you just let nature do the work. And if you're to try to bring that big Tonka toy, so to speak, to use Joe Whedon's words, Dr. Joe Whedon's words, that's going to end up costing you a lot of money if you're looking at the landscape or watershed scale. Just going to go to the next one. And again, the reason why we're interested in using beaver is because they're nature's engineers. They're actually called the ecosystem engineer. Reason being is that they create ecosystems. And they're also known as a keystone species because, as this next little picture can illustrate quite well, picture taken from Heidi Perryman of Worth the Dam Beaver Advocacy Group down in Martinez near San Francisco Bay Area. Beaver kind of holds a lot of species in place, at least in a lot of regions of North America where beaver are native and where they were actually abundant up until the 18th, 19th century fur trades, and now they're making a comeback. But yeah, they, as you can see on the right immediately to the right, that beaver, there's a wolf. And if you should check it out later, don't have time to go into this tangent now, but Yellowstone National Park, wolves and game, beaver have an interesting role in that little story there. And so again, beaver, keystone species, creates a bunch of benefits for environments, creates basically wetlands, as you can see in this picture. And man, there's just a whole host of benefits that often have been cited as beaver, starting with the geochemical. You have carbon storage, denitrification, pollutant sinks of the beaver ponds. Water, you have temperature modulation, you have perennialization of streams, if that's a word, not sure. And yeah, you also have a lot of groundwater storage as a possible outcome of having beaver dams kind of strewn throughout the landscape. And then I think besides that, yeah, just as you can see in that picture, increased fish populations are possible, waterfowl. So hunter groups could be interested in having more beaver, you name it. Let's go to the next one. And again, if you have beaver in a watershed, it's ultimately just a chance to pursue this low-tech process-based restoration. And as you can see in that top right-hand corner is people installing basically stakes that go into the river bed, river stream, and you could interweave willow sticks, whatnot. And this can help beaver get a foothold in what might otherwise be streams that have too fast flowing waters, too much stream power in them. And yeah, it's just one possibility that can help create this or jumpstart this process-based restorations if you have beaver. But, and I'm about to jump into this next slide, we need to proceed with caution. And that's essentially what my whole research was. Because as we could see, go to the next one. The problem is scope of past research is not necessarily favorable for Southern California. Devin and I were actually discussing this the other day, and there seems to be a huge beaver blind spot. It's probably why a bunch of you guys are here right now. A bunch of us are here. So we want to learn more about beavers. We haven't heard about beavers before. And that seems to be the case, at least as you go further and further south in California. And this appendix right here from my research thesis basically shows this in stark terms. 46 studies I found that had to do with California beaver studies. Only 12 were kind of within the scope of what I consider to be related to the type of research I was doing. And of those, only 3, or about 25%, had to do with Central Coast, South Coast type beaver. So beyond that, if we go ahead and click again, we can see that there's a stark difference between there could be between Northern and Southern California based on hydrologic region. Hydrologic region is how the Department of Water Resources kind of doles out, or how should I say it, manages state of California. And I chose to divide this appendix up by that because ultimately beaver are reliant on water, and how water flows is pretty much classified by hydrologic region. And so the Central Coast tends to have a bit more flashy type of water stream, and that's a bit different from a bunch of Northern California areas where you might get water more evenly throughout the year. And so anyways, what this ecology management and conservation implications of North American beaver has to do with this is that these are dryland streams or semi-arid streams, might be a bit more flashier, and that ultimately will affect how whether beaver dam analogs or BDAs are even appropriate or whatnot. So we need to take a look at that, and that's what my research was set out to do. As far as the next one goes, status quo, let's go ahead and next click, please. Across California, there have been efforts to basically show the actual updated pre-1950s or whenever they actually reintroduced beavers to California through dumping them out through parachute planes and whatnot. There were efforts basically this is a recent effort in 2013 to show what the actual correct distribution of beavers was. Unfortunately, I can't use this. It would not be the best to use this to basically extrapolate, okay, beavers are going to be in this area, because if we're interested in looking at beaver for beaver assisted restoration efforts, we need to know if they're actually going to be in an area where we'd say, where we'd insert a beaver dam analog, because we actually want beaver to come there and to try to be there and make them do the work for us. We basically, it sounds bad, but we're trying to make like slave labor out of them, kind of. Not really. I'll probably try to retract that statement later at some point. But anyways, yeah, and so this, unfortunately, the scope was good as a starting point, but we needed more accurate information. That's kind of what I set out to do as well. As far as other evaluations that have been done, let's go to the next one, please. This is one that was done by Kate Lundquist, a well-known beaver restoration researcher up in Occidental in Northern California. Unfortunately, this evaluation, in my opinion, does not cut it, because there's a saying that goes, wildlife management or conservation is 90% people management, 10% wildlife animal management. And to me, they were a bit too conservative in how they did or assessed the prospects of having beaver. They didn't really conduct any formal surveys of humans. At least that was my understanding of what their ideas were potentially for getting beaver assisted restoration efforts or BAR efforts going. And this is relevant because the next one, go and click. Yeah, it's trying to be a bit clever there, making it look like a beaver was surveying the landscape out there. Anyways, BRAT stands for Beaver Restoration Assessment Tool. This is a Utah State University designed GIS, or Geographic Information System tool, developed to basically predict the capacity of landscape to carry beaver dams. And again, this tool is very conflict avoidance focused, kind of like the assessment done for the North Fork Kern River drainage. And again, just to me, that did not quite sit right as far as trying to evaluate an entirely new ecosystem, because we're trying to be creative in the field of restoration. You need to be creative, and to do that, you know, and try to start with an open mind and try to get different ideas going. And so to me, that wasn't as helpful. And plus, it was very beaver dams focused. And whole point with the past, whole point was showing you that dry land streams beaver is that oftentimes beaver in environments like this don't rely on dams as much. So let's go to the next one, please. And so finally, what my response was as far as research going, what we were going to do was we were going to do a three-pronged research. We were going to do, go ahead, beaver dam field surveys across 10 different areas, basically 5 and 5, 5 in the lower watershed, 5 in the upper watershed, and basically check out dams, pretty much measure them. And we would also use, if you go ahead and click the next one, please, qualitative data through email surveys and interviews. So basically combine those two as far as trying to find, okay, validation points for the BRAT or the GIS model that I then implemented, and also just to get a better understanding, please click next, of this whole study goal, which was, I'm an undergrad, just coming out undergrad. Yes, I have experience. I don't have as much experience as a geomorphology master's students to do, calculate the groundwater storage potential in this area. For instance, I don't have the tools for that. Best I thought I could do was give a good start as far as where the issues are, what are the most pressing needs for beaver assisted restoration research in this basin. How we're going to do that, click next, please. We're going to check that out through 3 main ways right here. Creation of beaver damming consistent range map, which I'll touch on next. We're going to talk about beaver behavior, relevant beaver behavior, and then also human dimensions, and then wrap that all up to talk about BARD recommendations. Please, next. And so again, just I think this is probably what most people are most interested in, just how widespread are beaver in the watershed. Let's talk about this map here. I'll try to be quick because I know time is going here and we all have places to be. So as you can see, dark green and light green are pretty much the main things you need to pay attention to. Dark green is where my various different types of data points, you can check this out later if they're recording this video, basically showed beaver to be. Light green, best way to think of the light green areas is just areas where I unfortunately was not able to get during my field surveys, did not get enough or quite a lot of people talking about in terms of the qualitative data interviews and surveys, that responses I was reading about. Or simply put, it was clear to me that these were through those qualitative, basically anecdotal data, that is kind of like a highway for beaver at points and different points in the season. So let's go ahead and go next. I think one of the biggest takeaways you could take away from this is that there seems to be a strong human reliance with beaver here. A lot of the regions of dark green, or where there's consistent damming, whether that's year round or seasonal, year to year, a lot of that is by wastewater treatment plants where they're putting out like tertiary water that's been treated or cleaned, or simply put, it's right outside of a dam, like Nacimiento Dam or San Antonio. And essentially, because of that, there's water year round, and beaver need water year round to thrive or to be the best they can, so to speak. So with this 2/3 of these dark green watersheds having these features, I think it's safe to say that there's some sort of at least association there that should be noted. As far as historical distribution, I thought it'd be interesting to note that honestly, I think it's mostly just speculation, but because on the one hand, long ago, you probably had a lot more groundwater in the basin, so that might have led to more areas with perennial or year-round water, surface water, that is. But on the other hand, nowadays you have the dams, which are providing more year-round water to some other areas. As far as home range dynamics, I think this goes hand in hand with damming dynamics. As I was saying earlier, a lot of beavers are in the Salinas River watershed are den dwellers. That means they kind of carve right into the bank where water is going to cover. Or if you're looking at my hand right now, water is going to cover them and basically allow them to kind of live up on a little ledge or something and be safe from predators, versus constructing a whole dam and backing up the water to make that same type of refuge. I think this next photo kind of illustrates the home range dynamics and damming dynamics well. If you could go ahead and click next, please. And this is with that, just by doing a Google Earth kind of flyover, I'm looking for beaver dams and recording them between the April 2015, kind of towards at the height of the last drought we had, and then June 2017 when it was non-drought. On the bottom, what we can see is that there's a stark difference in terms of damming density. And so it seems to be, at least, and again, maybe this is just a one-off in terms of how the county public works water agencies were managing the water at the time and doing flow regulation, flood releases, but it seems to be that beaver might tend to do more damming when there's less water, which makes more sense. On the main stem there, if it's a normal year, they're going to have huge floods of water, and that's going to be better just for bank denning and not necessarily damming. The whole point being how they expand, how they're able, where they're able to go might change between dry seasons or droughts and regular, what is regular anymore, I guess, and not drought years. Let's go next, please. So again, going back to that quote I said earlier, or tried to say earlier about 90% being people management and 10% animal management, I thought it was important, again, in my research to try to highlight some of the human dimensions that we should think about as far as if we're looking towards beaver for assisting us in restoration. And I know it seems kind of dark just going straight away and saying our beavers being killed left and right in the watershed, but I've gotten this question / people on emails about people worried that beavers are being killed too rapidly or something, and there's going to be none left. And I think we really need to look at three kind of evidence lines to kind of at least get a better understanding of this. First one being riparian, professional, and private landholder attitudes toward beaver. Second one being what the depredation, or basically when the beaver is being a nuisance to a farm owner, a landowner, landholder, whatever, they can call in and get a depredation permit to kill that so it can stop being a nuisance. That's kind of extreme, but that's one way to deal with a naughty beaver, I guess. And then finally, we need to take a look at some field survey observations and what these might suggest. So as far as the next one, as far as the first one, riparian, professional and private landholder attitudes go, again, this might not be the best thing to go ahead and say everyone, because again, we got to take a look at our population of study cases who responded to this question. There's just few riparian, relatively few riparian professionals and private landowners. But generally what it says is most people think fairly positively of beaver. What was interesting is that the more, and it's actually, to be frank, somewhat predictable, is that the more tempered attitudes were from people like riparian professionals who had to deal with the nuisance beaver, with helping with the depredation, along with one biologist who is working with arroyo toad, which I'll talk about a bit later, and how that has implications for her work. Let's go next. And so as far as the depredation permits go, let's take a look at the far right corner there. Beaver, Castor canadensis 069510000000000. Yeah, 31. Pretty much the whole point of this is to say that, frankly, beaver are actually seem kind of shy, / are not getting into too much trouble compared to other species / other species are perhaps of greater concern to wildlife conservationists, managers, and whatnot, perhaps even hunters. Now let's go to the next slide to see why, or try to understand a bit why. We're actually, yeah. And so these were some photos taken from my field surveys. First one you can see there is from San Ardo. Arrows pointing to a big bush, but I'm not actually trying to point to the bush. I'm trying to point to what's out no more than probably like 30 meters away from that bush, which is a slope that leads to a farm fence. Essentially, that bush, I think, is probably willow or whatnot. Beaver don't really have a reason to go further out there. A lot of places on the Salinas, they already have some food that's right there, right for them. As far as the next photo goes, this just goes to show kind of the same idea, but that geomorphology is important to take into consideration. It's on Arroyo Seco. The top arrow that you see there is pointing to a farm fence. Again, there's no way a beaver is going to scale that, little, whatever, that precipice up to the top there. Again, that just call for, that'd be like extreme time, extreme measures. I don't know what that beaver would be thinking. As far as the very bottom goes, I mean, that's almost looks like it could be a national park. Yeah, I mean, essentially, that's what's going for beaver. I could show you on another map if I had time, one to, but a lot of where beaver are is it's hard to get places for hunters. And for hunters who do go to the area, they're often there to get deer, help with feral hog or feral pig containment or whatnot. Beaver simply probably isn't worth the effort for them. Okay, let's go next, please. So again, as I alluded to earlier, there's, now that we've kind of solved this conundrum, but question about whether beaver are being hunted severely in this area, we need to think about some other important elements to managing wildlife, which is other kind of competition, so to speak. And one thing that stood out from my research was just the rodeo toad, at least in one area near Fort Hunter Liggett, and perhaps a bit away from there. We got to consider what the beaver dams that exist, how these are influencing growth of species that are invasive, such as, go ahead and click next, please. Yeah, the whole point here wasn't to show how much fun we were having, this pure system they recruited in me. The whole point is to show that there is a bunch of species out there that I did not know about. And it became apparent to me that this would be something for someone else to maybe tackle, is to try to catalog those types of species that are there. How many of those are, you know, arundo or might be benefiting? So there's a lot of stuff we don't know. And in regards to invasive species, the same goes with hunting, the hunting popularity in the basin, which is something we must consider as well. I know beaver advocacy organizations have had a tendency to kind of condemn hunting of beavers and try to get like a moratorium on that going, or suggest that. Here, I'm not sure that would be the best thing. Simply put, as I told you, we probably have at least a few hundred beavers in the basin. They have some steady areas where they're not going to go away, where they could recoup. And the hunters I did interview or talk to, you know, they didn't seem, you know, hell-bent on destroying the populations. You know, they definitely enjoy the beaver company, so to speak. But they did raise something, which is why I have this photo down in the right-hand corner, which is, you know, general knowledge, not just of them, but everyone in the basin about, you know, one hunter was saying, oh yeah, I like how at night I could hear all the like bullfrogs creaking. And I was like, these bullfrogs are invasive species. They're actually competition for the arroyo toad. And so just trying to better understand that is something that we need to consider going forward as far as trying to implement restoration measures. So next, please. And so to synthesize all that, again, I didn't go into the specific benefits of beaver for this area, specifically for this watershed specifically, because I was trying to get to the thinking points we might be most interested in knowing about. But ultimately, at the end of the day, appropriate FAR measures are going to depend on where in the watershed you're at, when, again, as I was saying earlier about the damming during drought, non-drought, how flow regulation